Okay, AP Psychers, we are moving on to lesson 2B, which is going to be about the neuron. 2C will be similar to the neuron, it'll be about neurotransmitters. So as we look at the neuron, let me go back here and we see, you don't have to draw this yet, we're going to draw this in class, but these branches here, this would be the part of the receiving neuron. The branches over here are part of the sending neuron. So how a neuron works is it receives information in this area, gets the information into the cell body or nucleus where it understands what it is, sends it down the axon here to these terminal branches, and then these branches release neurotransmitters across what we call the synapse, which we'll talk about. And then there'll be another neuron where the dendrite side will be that will accept those messages. So the neuron is a pretty amazing little structure. And again, in class, we'll be talking more specifically about how they work. So getting ready with our notes. Capital B is because we're talking about our second major portion of this unit. So we're going to call that the neuron, and we're going to define the neuron as simply the basic building block of the nervous system. Okay, the basic building block of the nervous system. Also, sometimes the neuron is sometimes referred to as a nerve cell. Okay, so the structure of the neuron, and we don't need an equal sign there because we're not going to define the structure of the neuron unless you don't know what structure means. In which case you can look it up. So let's look at the structure of the neuron. We have certain parts of the neuron that we need to understand. First of all, we have the dendrite, which again is this portion here. And we're going to define the dendrite as branches that are capable of receiving information. Okay, branches that are capable of receiving information. The information then leaves the dendrite into the cell body, which is responsible for processing information. Processing information. The nucleus is found within that cell body, but we don't need to define that for our purposes. The information from the cell body will then go to the axon, and the axon we will define as a terminal through which the message travels in order to get to new neurons. Okay, the terminal through which the message travels in order to get to other neurons. Okay, so if we go back, this long terminal here would be considered the axon, and these little bubbles, for lack of a better term, that surround the axon are what we refer to as the myelin sheath. Okay, so the myelin sheath is a protective layer for the axon that promotes the speed of the neural impulse. Okay, it's a protective layer for the axon that promotes the speed of the neural impulse. So the myelin sheath allows the message to get through the axon faster. If you know anybody or ever heard of the disease MS or multiple sclerosis, MS is a breakdown in the myelin sheath. So if you think about it, it makes sense. If you know anybody, unfortunately, who has MS, especially severe MS, it can manifest itself in different ways. Sometimes they have trouble with their vision, and eventually the vision will narrow until the point where they may be blind, or they might struggle with walking, and then it gets progressively worse. And if you think about it, if the myelin sheath is responsible for getting the message through quicker, if your brain tells your legs to walk and you don't have MS, then that message will get there quick and you'll be able to walk. But if the myelin sheath is damaged, then the brain will try to send the message to the legs, but that message, because the sheath isn't there, the message will be slower, and the walk will have a gait to it initially, and then as the myelin sheath continues to break down, they may that gait will become worse and worse until the point where they may not even be able to walk. So that's what we'll see there. Okay, the nodes of Ranvier, we're not going to define it. There's no equal sign next to it. You can see it's just these little gaps between the myelin sheath. So we're not going to worry about that too much. Just want to mention it. Okay. Then our next part of the neuron are called terminal buttons, and they're tips at the end of the neuron or axon if you're still considering the terminal, but we'll say tips at the end of the neuron that secrete neurotransmitters. Okay. So they're tips at the end of the axon that secrete neurotransmitters. Within those terminal buttons, we'll find synaptic vesicles. And a synaptic vesicle is kind of like a little bubble where the neurotransmitters are held, okay? So and we'll talk about the process of communication, but if those vesicles get enough electrical current through them, then they will in turn release from the terminal button across the synapse. So going back again here, these are what we would call the terminal buttons. And at the end of these branches, we would see these vesicles, okay? And if the neural impulse, again, is strong enough to travel, it'll get to this terminal button. The synaptic vesicle will release the neurotransmitters across that synapse, okay? So our last part of the neuron isn't really even a part because the synapse is actually a space. It's like a gap, okay? So the synapse is a gap between neurons that the neurotransmitter has to cross, okay? It's a gap between neurons that a neurotransmitter has to cross, okay? And here I want you to skip, 8 lines, 10 lines, or whatever of notes. So depending on where your notes are, skip some lines because we're gonna come back to that in class. Okay, and the second part of this short video, this one's a short one I hope, is to describe the communication process of the neuron. And we'll also be referring back to the visual when we do that. So there are certain phases a neuron goes through when it communicates. And right now, most of your neurons are at what we call resting potential. Okay, if you look at those two words, they're at rest, but they have the potential to fire. So we're going to say that resting potential is when a neuron is at rest. And I'm going to add it has a negative charge inside the cell. Okay, neuron is at rest. It has a negative charge inside the cell. So right now, for example, your left big toe, prior to me maybe saying it, but your left big toe has neurons that are in it, and there are neurons within your brain that are responsible for moving your left big toe that are at rest. Okay, so now if you're one of those people who has to move your big toe because I'm talking about it, those neurons are no longer at rest. So we'll talk about that in a second, right? So the neurons that are at rest have a negative charge inside of them, okay? Once they reach threshold, and threshold is the level of stimulation necessary to trigger an impulse. Okay, once they reach threshold, and that's the level of stimulation necessary to trigger an impulse, then the neuron will start its firing process. So when, like if I say to move your big toe right now, okay, there's a neuron in your brain that's responsible, there are multiple neurons in your brain responsible for moving that left big toe, and the first neuron that fired tried to get the second neuron to reach threshold, and then eventually there would be movement of the big toe. All right, action potential is when the neuron actually fires. Okay, so if there is enough of an impulse from the threshold, then the action potential will take place, and the neuron will begin its firing process. And the highlight of this process is what we call depolarization. And depolarization is when the negative charge inside the cell is replaced by a positive charge, and that is depolarization, okay? You might want to write ions after the charge. So let's picture this again. Let's go all the way back to the neuron. And we, right now, in that left big toe, if you're not moving it, there's a negative charge inside the axon, okay? There's a positive charge outside. When you start to move your left big toe, those positive ions come into the axon and the negative ions leave the axon, and it just shoots on down the axon, and that is the depolarization piece, okay? So if you want to picture a threshold occurring at the dendrite, action potential occurring in the cell body, depolarization occurring in the axon, that might help to understand it, okay? Now, once a neuron fires, it experiences what we call a refractory period, okay? And a refractory period is a brief pause between neural firing, okay? It's a brief pause between neural firing. And that's also, there's an inability to fire again, okay? So if, for example, I told you on Tuesday in class, and I'm not going to do this because some people don't like feet, but if I told you to take your socks and shoes off and move your big toe, and I told you move it again, move it again, move it again, move it again, and I said you weren't doing it fast enough, you need to make it move faster, 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 to the point where I can't even, it should be moving so fast that I can't even see it moving. You won't be able to do that. And one way you might consider that is that that refractory period, that brief pause, is my inability to keep it moving nonstop. Okay, so hopefully that will make some sense. I'm going to add, actually, now that I think about it, I should have put this term in. So I'm going to add it on this slide, actually. Okay, I'll make this a 3. And we're going to call this all or nothing principle. Okay, and then we'll go back, and you'll see it, kind of. I'm in the way. I can move myself. Okay. Finally, we have something called the all or nothing principle, and that is the simple understanding that it's kind of like when if you pull the trigger on a gun. Once you pull that trigger, there's no getting it back, and that's how a neuron fires. Once a neuron fires, it fires, okay? So it's an all or nothing principle that once a neuron fires, it can't stop firing, okay? One way to remember the communication process of a neuron is to consider a toilet, okay? So if someone goes into the bathroom, they walk in the bathroom, they look at the toilet, and the toilet is at rest, right? It's not flushing on its own. It's not doing anything on its own. It's just there. Then a person does whatever they have to do, and they push the lever on the toilet, right? And I don't know if have you ever pushed a lever on a toilet and it didn't flush? Okay, you didn't quite push it hard enough, right? So it didn't reach threshold. So pushing that lever hard enough is causing threshold to occur. Once threshold occurs, all right, then action potential happens, and that is when the toilet begins its actual flush, right? So it went from the handle, threshold, or in our case, the dendrite, to action potential, the cell body or the toilet. Then depolarization happens. Remember, depolarization is getting the negative ions leave, okay? The gross stuff gets flushed, and it's replaced by fresh water. I don't know if it's water you want to drink or not, but it's fresh water. And that's the depolarization process. And if you've ever flushed a toilet and tried to flush it again while it's flushing, it can't flush, right? And that's the refractory period. Isn't that awesome? So you walk in, the toilet's at rest, do what you got to do, press the lever, that's threshold. The toilet starts to flush, that's action potential. Good water replaces bad water, that's depolarization. And then you can't reflush it, that's the refractory period. Okay, so it might be a good idea for this unit that every time in fact, it's an assignment. Okay? Every time you go to the bathroom, I want you to walk in the bathroom and yell really loud, resting potential. Do what you got to do, and then press the lever and yell as loud as you can, threshold. As the toilet enters, yell action potential, and then yell depolarization as you watch the new water fill, and then refractory period as you try to reflush the toilet. Okay, so yeah, I should be hearing this. If you ask to go to the bathroom in class, or I see you walk in the bathroom while I'm in the hall, I'm going to stand outside, and I expect to hear this coming from the bathroom. You should be yelling nice and loud. Actually, one time during parent-teacher conferences, I had a parent sit down and say, can you tell me why my child is yelling every time she goes to the bathroom? And I said, well, it depends. What is she yelling? And she said, fortunately, Mom said, I don't know. I hear like threshold and things like that. And I said, good. That means she's just learning the communication process of the neuron. So I expect some emails, conferences with parents asking what's going on if you don't explain it to them first. Might be a good idea to explain it to them first. Okay, so that is our quick lesson on the neuron. Our next quick lesson will be on neurotransmitters. I look forward to it.